conversation about restricting access to books in schools and libraries across this nation, banning books. Before introducing our spirited panelists, I want to welcome you all to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Four Freedoms State Park. As the name suggests, the memorial celebrates President Roosevelt and his vision of universal human rights. Freedom of speech and expression, so timely tonight. Freedom of worship, thank you, Howard. Freedom from want, now we feel freer. Freedom from fear. He eloquently articulated those ideas and ideals in his January 6, 1941 State of the Union address, but he and Eleanor in so many other ways represented those ideas. I'm proud to represent the Four Freedoms Park Conservancy, where I've served on the board for since 2011. We are the group who participated in building and then donating this park to the people of New York State. And now partner with the New York State Park Service to program this magnificent memorial design, last designed by Louis Kahn. And that is part of tonight, the programming. And my father was deeply involved in imagining and implementing this extraordinary park. Our goal tonight, and as it is always, is to inspire conversation and reflection on the Four Freedoms and President Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt's enduring legacy. A heartfelt thanks to New York State Parks, represented tonight, I think. I don't know if the weather was an obstacle. Leslie Wright, New York State and Angela Steinberg, our very own park director. And we also deeply appreciate the National Heritage Trust for their financial support of our programs. And a warm welcome to all the Four Freedoms Park Conservancy board members present tonight. I want to introduce our great panelists and just say a few words before. You're going to hear a lot of interesting, important, I think also actionable steps we can take to make sure we still live in a strong democracy. Christine Emaran, Director of Youth Free Expression Program at the National Coalition Against Censorship. National Coalition and the Youth Free Expression Program works with teachers and administrators to push back against book bans, has a fellowship for high schoolers to become advocates against book bans, and a film contest centered around free speech. Nick Buron, like Huron, I've learned, the Great Lake in Michigan, also the Port Huron Statement. Nick Buron was named Queens Public Library's Chief Librarian in 2016, overseeing public library service at each of the library's 66 locations, leads a 700-person team that is responsible for the library's collections, programming, outreach, and customer experience, and he's just been elected to the ALA's, American Library Association's Executive Advisory Committee. Congratulations. And I want to introduce Megan Madison, educator and author of Our Skin, a first conversation on race. And Megan is a political educator. She earned her PhD in social policy from Brandeis University and has served on the boards of the National Association for Education for Young Children and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. Amy Mikel runs the Unbanned Leader program at the Brooklyn Public Library. Amy is the Director of Customer Experience at Brooklyn Public Library and awarded Librarian of the Year by Library Journal in 2023. You'll hear more about books unbanned. And I just want to say we come together today. The past 2 years, though we've seen it in this country before, have demonstrated a mounting crisis of book bans. You can see on the invitation, and this reported by the Wall Street Journal, some 4,000 book bans between 2021 today. There's been a sustained focus on banning books written for young adults, especially when these books are about, quote, difficult topics like violence and racism, or include historically marginalized identities. I think we all face this issue, not just those in Florida, where banning books is, Florida's number one, okay, in terms of banning books. Safe, something's happened. Texas, South Carolina, Missouri, Philadelphia. But I'll tell you, I was in Florida a few months ago, and Judy Blume has a great bookstore. Judy Blume's been fighting this for years. What is it? It's Me, God. Me, Margaret. It's a great story. There have been more bans, but they're more comprehensive, potentially more important. And within that, and I know we'll talk about it, there are attacks on librarians and fundamentally attacks on libraries. It's a great civic space that I think we all respect. And I want to begin with Nick and Amy, because you're at the library at the heart of this, and ask what, no turkeys, stop.
This never happens
Why do
anymore.
books, they are protesting the banning of books. Why do books get banned in the first place? I'll begin with Amy and then Nick.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Well, I'll start with the definition so that we're kind of grounded. And the American Library Association, as well as PEN America, has similar definitions, but I'm going to go with the ALA definition, which is pretty straightforward. A book ban, put simply, is the removal of materials from a library based on the objections of a person or a group of people. And inherent in that definition is the idea that the removal of those materials is not supported by the entire community that's using that library. That in some cases it's going against explicit policies or practices put in place about what kind of books should be in those libraries. So, like you were saying, we're seeing kind of an alarming increase, a very alarming increase in people asking for this to happen, and indeed that it is happening. And I also want to say that book bans don't always take the same shape and form. I just want to introduce people to the spectrum of how this happens. We do see the individual person, maybe they're a parent, maybe they're a concerned member of the community, just get taken in by this idea that there's something inherently bad in these books, that children will be harmed by their content, and they're really just kind of emotionally brought along with the idea, and they go to their local library and they get involved in this sense of justice, that we have to do something about these bad books. The opposite end of the spectrum is what is happening at a scale that we have not seen in recent years, and they're very orchestrated, well-funded, well-coordinated attempts at removing books en masse from school libraries and public libraries. Typically those focused on younger children or our teen readers, and typically those that are buying about LGBTQIA voices, BIPOC voices, difficult topics, and gender, sexuality, things that grown-ups feel kids shouldn't be reading. So why is this happening? Again, it's multidimensional. I do think some of this comes from the parent, the parent of that 5-year-old who wants to protect their young child from the icky parts of the world. And I heard a quote recently that was really interesting, is that the attempt is to child-proof the world rather than world-proofing the child. So this idea that it's actually good, helpful, when you read it in a book, when the book is written at an age-appropriate level, when that topic is encountered with a supportive grown-up, that these are really the best ways to encounter difficult topics, and we shouldn't be hiding them, we shouldn't be pulling them away. There are parents of teens who are growing out of childhood and becoming adults, and it's scary as a parent to feel that they're going out in the world, they're learning about sex, they're learning about drugs, they're learning about difficult topics. So the parent concern is a big piece of it. What I was talking to Megan and Christine about is this idea of public institutions like public schools and public libraries reflecting back how culture, our society is changing. And what I really think is at the root of a lot of these bans is this idea that typically these voices that have been marginalized for so long, the numbers we've seen just from publishers is that they typically represent only 3% of the books in a library's collection. Now that number is growing. There's a huge interest in publishers and other creators to get those voices into published books, to get those books on the shelf. And that's being reflected back to us. And I don't know if a lot of people like what is being reflected back on us. It's reflected a vastly changing society. A lot of diversity is coming out into the forefront very quickly, and I think the root of some of these book bans is an attempt to, frankly.
Thank you, Amy. There's a lot to unpack there.
Thank you.
Yeah, Nick, yeah.
You said it really well. What I'd like to step back for a moment and also see from my point of view is, why do people do this? And I think the root of this, from what I see, is it is a sense of self that I can start making decisions for other people. And this seems to be something that has really increased over the last few years, that what I believe is paramount to what other people believe. And we see this played out in different areas as well. Combine that with a sense of fear. And fear, whether it's I want to protect my kid or I don't want people in my community to see something. At its core, people are fearful of the information that can come out. And so when you combine those two things, it's a very powerful force that motivates people to get to the point where you say, I think something is not appropriate, not only for me, but I don't want my neighbor reading this either. That's a big jump to go from it's not appropriate for my family to it's not appropriate for any family. And just to take it one step further as well, as Amy was saying, like there really is, it's really important to see this very broad, because when a book is banned, people start talking about it, it makes the papers, it's a big deal. What we see, especially in, here, even here in New York City, we see that sometimes, as other places in the country. But what is much more subtle, and I think in some ways much more dangerous, is books that get challenged on a one-to-one basis, where someone will go to the children's librarian when no one is there, and not to necessarily be intimidating, but to say, this book should not be in your collection. They're not necessarily saying take it, ban it, and they're going to go out to the street, but they're going to say, I object to this book. You should not be doing this. Somehow there's something wrong with the way you are buying books, that you buy this, and sort of attack on that level. And so what happens next? That librarian who doesn't want that person to come back the next time when that second book comes out, where there are more books in the shelf, and we have very limited funding to be able to, we cannot buy every book. Now that librarian in a very quiet way has to make a decision of what books to buy and what books not to buy. And so they're going to be like, listen, I don't want to deal with this person anymore. I'm just not going to buy the book at all. And that is quiet, it is subtle, and that in itself does not make the papers. But that is how quietly censorship and book banning can take effect in your communities.
Thank you. Christine and Megan, I wanted to ask from your perspective and where you sit, how do you see the banning of books as a proxy issue in terms of what we're seeing as fear, what we're seeing as disruption? But I'm also struck that in Louisiana, I think just a few weeks ago, there's an anti-American Library Association bill, and there are anti-librarian bills that are beginning to crop up. Do you see deeper context in which banning is happening? You mentioned the publishing houses, and Amy.
Well, it's becoming weaponized. I think it's a political issue, and we've seen that since 2021, especially in elections in Virginia. It became a political issue. So I think what Nick and Nick was talking about was that in the past, if someone objected to a book, this would be handled behind the scenes, right? But now, it's not sufficient. That the trust in institutions such as librarians have been broken. So they go to the next level, which is the politicians. And so politicians now are drafting laws to address this public panic that's occurring, throughout the United States. And what we've seen, the first hysteria came as a backlash to critical race theory, which was never taught and there are no books about that for students. It's a law area. Exactly. She'll speak up when it's that. But it was
They were law students.
correct. It started in law school. It's for graduate studies. It's not being taught et cetera. But somehow it was disinformation spread that like a virus, that this idea of contagion of indoctrination was happening, and students were getting information, and teachers were teaching politics, and this should be taking place at home, and schools were to be for math and science and not for political education. And so it became such an uproar in the community that politicians were involved in drafting laws to address the community of some a few, which became, they're very vocal in terms of their voices. And some of them, such as the Moms for Liberty, which we'll talk about a little bit later, started political PACs. And so it worked like a political campaign in that it was grassroots. There were curated lists of books that were objectionable based on, quotes that were taken out of context, so books were not being read as a whole. And so this kind of fed into a hysteria that in the last 20 years, there's been a lot more maturity in terms of themes and books, and we are concerned that our children are being harmed by it. We have mental health issues, and the cause of it might be what they're reading, or we don't know what they're reading. And I think a lot of parents were more involved in their children's education during the pandemic than they had ever been before. And this kind of, from the mask debate, there are many hysteria over whether or not to wear masks, to then that diverted into schools and how schools were being taught in terms of like what kinds of books were being read. And within the last 15 years, as was said before, there's a decolonization in terms of publishers and offering books that represent public school students, which are in some states the minorities are the majorities in these particular schools, and they were not having books that represented their experiences. And also this allows students that didn't have this experience to come into contact with other students and develop sort of empathy that kind of led into some of the movements that we saw that were multiracial, because they were had an ability to kind of have an affinity with groups of people that were unlike themselves. So I think that within all of the hysteria, it led parents and politicians to take a pause that things were going too fast. Seeing these political movements that were young and multiracial, that perhaps it's what they're reading. Perhaps some of it was sexuality, fear, hysteria, that by reading a book about a topic, this could change their children into something else. And that also became, part of the rhetoric for these laws that became to ban books on race and history, sexuality studies, and this became, it started in particular states, but then it spread throughout the United States. And so today that, the laws kind of put fear into educators that had these particular books that might fall, within these broad laws, that, they were subject to being labeled as a, pedophile or, groomer, or subject to being arrested, for having these books in their collection. So it put a lot of fear, and also self-censorship within teachers of English as well as librarians. So these are, kind of the intention of these laws, because they were so, vague, that, the students, the librarians and others should opt out in terms of having these books in their collections, or even wanting to have a discussion.
You're right, that this has been with us, I think, in the 70s, and the school board fights then. But there does seem to be copycat legislation. There are groups that have done that for other areas, and you see it spread in state legislatures. But I wanted to come to you, Megan, tell us a bit about your work. You mentioned the book you've written is for a generation which hasn't been reading critical race theory in legal textbooks.
Yeah, as a person who studies critical race theory, I graduate on Sunday with a PhD in social policy. And who also, before doctoral study, was teaching pre-K, was teaching in a Head Start center. I realized that I needed to translate some of the heady, theoretical conversations that were happening in academia and in my activist and movement circles in language that young children, their educators, their families, all of their loving grown-ups could understand. And so it was actually kind of surprising to me when the far right started attacking critical race theory, and my colleagues, imaginary and real on the left, started saying things like, who's doing that? No one's even teaching critical race theory in schools, which essentially erased the important work that I was and am currently doing. And so I think becoming aware that there are folks in our movement who are doing that work, and then having our back and supporting us would be more helpful than saying we're not doing it. And I think it's also interesting for me with doctoral training, we're socialized to pontificate, but pontificate on the things that we really know about. And so book banning is not a thing that is part of my PhD study, and so I try to stay out of pontificating about why someone psychologically would feel threatened by progress we making in society, or, certainly there are people who study that and get into the psychology, but instead I'm taught to research. So when I finished my dissertation, I went to a school board meeting, and I was actually kind of surprised when I sat there and watched the members of a school board. In New York City, we don't call them school boards, we call them community education councils. And the largest the largest district in New York City public schools is District 2, which starts at the bottom of Manhattan, in the financial district, and goes all the way up the Upper East Side. And there's actually a little carve out for a different district for the Lower East Side, but it's the largest district in New York City public schools. And I sat in that community education council meeting, and one of the sitting school board members started talking about my book. And she said, our skin should not be available in New York City public schools. And she said she talks about this every chance she can get, because when she does, it whips up a lot of ire and support and momentum among her far right base. And so that was a real aha for me. I think I had assumed that the people who are challenging and trying to ban books are coming from a good faith but maybe confused place. And I realized when I actually got involved in trying to do something about it, the people who are trying to ban books in New York City are not good faith actors. It's actually quite politically calculating and bad faith. And that was really interesting for me to learn. And then when I did a little bit more research, learning the majority of book bans and challenges are from a very small number of people also. So actually getting to know the names of the people in our communities and of the individuals and of the organizations that are advancing this agenda is kind of step one to getting in the way of it. I don't necessarily know what's going on in their minds, in their hearts, in their homes, but I do think it's important to show up at our school board meetings. I think there's 3 of us in the audience at that school board meeting. Maybe there were more people online, but nobody was there. And I think, and since then, I posted on social media, the last school board meeting, there were over 200 families there speaking vocally in support of the freedom to read and all kinds of other freedoms. And so I think part of the issue is we just got to start showing up and be honest about the stakes of the current moment that we're in. Because the arc of the moral universe can bend towards justice, but honestly it bends towards whoever's pulling the hardest. And so if we want it to pull towards justice, it has to be us showing up and pulling it in that direction. Because when we sit at home and just scroll through a Twitter feed or talk to people like us about how terrible it is that there's far-right actors who are trying to ban books, it's not actually showing up at the school board meeting and making the difference that we need to make, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Secular amen. Wanted to just pick up with Amy and Nick, but I was reading Run for Something. It's a group that young people running down ballot, and they're seeking people to run for school boards or whatever you call them. So I think there's an awareness that Liberties for Mom or Mom for Liberties can't just stand alone, and there are people of goodwill who want to. I'm thinking of other ways to navigate this issue of fear. Are there places where people, parents and community boards, others can exchange ideas about books, probably. I'm thinking of Ta-Nehisi Coates, the writer, someone I know a little, who actually went to Virginia, to one of the schools, to band, to meet with students and talk to them about his book. He asked if he could come, and I'm just wondering, are there conversations that are possible, or is it so polarized, as so much is in our country? The ability to say, for someone to say why he or she, they want to not see this book. I mean, that's giving too much, because right to read isn't supposed to be entrenched in our system. But these conversations, so I mean, and you do the work at the library, which is trying to push back against banning books, but from your perch, can you speak to that? That's not a new position, but it's not one that has been part of the library for decades.
So my title, once again, is Director of Customer Experience at the Brooklyn Public Library. So as part of that, I oversee decisions made about our collection, how we spend that money every year, and how we set up our policies around lending materials. How does it work to get a library card? It's actually very complicated. I could spend multiple hours. And I know that there is a place for people to show up and to march, and I prefer to do my work from the inside. I'm a systems person. How is the system broken? How can it be broken down further and then rebuilt and repaired? And one of the things that I did at Brooklyn Public Library was interrogate our library card sign-up policy. Where are we leaving people out, making it more difficult for them to get a library card? How can we simplify this? How can we make this more welcoming? Why do we do it this way? And have we really asked ourselves whether we just feel comfortable doing it this way, or if it really has to be that way? An example being, libraries typically ask for proof of residency, government issued ID. How are we making sure that everybody who deserves to have a library card because they live here is eligible to get one, even if they don't have that proof, they don't come with that proof? So that's one of the first things I did when I entered this position at Brooklyn Public Library, was make a lot of changes to our library card sign-up policy. And as part of the Books on Ban program, which was something that Brooklyn Public Library launched 2 years ago in 2022, which opens up our digital collection to any teen who wants it across the country, I started talking to other libraries and realized that many libraries nationwide were in a similar boat as Brooklyn Public Library, where we maybe needed to dust off and revisit our library card sign-up policies, because yes, book banning is a concern. We should be thinking about this and putting our own unique blend of advocacy around making sure that this doesn't continue to take root. There are many, many people, especially young people in the country, who don't really have ready access to books at all. So they're not even concerned about that one book that's been taken away from them. They can't even get a library card. They can't even get to the library. They don't even have the privacy to read the kinds of books that they need to be reading. So that's how I've tried to make some changes. I'm happy to elaborate, but
No, I think the inside outside is important.
yeah.
That's a great segue, because you're absolutely right. There are two things that I just thought about, and when you're talking about research, that 3% or whatever, the small group that's trying to impose on everybody else is doing very bad research, because they're just copying off of each other. They're sending lists to each other to books that they have not read, and that's infuriating.
Yeah.
You should not have this book. Did you read it?
Yeah.
I don't have to read it. That's maddening to
Sometimes they don't even have the book.
Exactly. And then the library's like, we don't have this book. It's like, well, okay.
It's in the adult section.
But what Amy was talking about is really what we've tried to do over the last few years. Many libraries around the country is make libraries more inviting. We are not book depositories. We are an open space. We're one of, maybe the only, whether it's your neighborhood in New York City or whether it's your small town outside somewhere in the country, it is one of the few, if not the only, open space where everybody in their neighborhood can come without being asked to pay for something without, being asked to have a social affiliation. No one's asking you about your economic background. It is the only place. There used to be other places, but there are not as much anymore. And the library is one of those places. So one of the things that we can do to really combat this is to increase our base, is to make the library more friendly, is to encourage more readers, to allow people, you're right, that have otherwise been left out of being able to get cards. People who are, do not have permanent housing. They're in the library all the time. They're the most difficult people that we've had traditionally to get cards in their hands so that they can take books home. They're coming back the next day. I trust them to bring their book back. It really is okay. And to increase, to get kids to have, to be able to get more books in the hands of kids. We eliminated, all 3 libraries in New York City eliminated fines a couple of years ago. Everyone, that is worth applause. Yes, and some people were like, that's irresponsible of you libraries because you're not good. That's how people return books. I can assure you, all of you had a late book at one time. I doubt that 5 cents, 10 cents a day was the thing that made you bring that book back. What made you bring the book back is that you understand that there is a social contract. That you take out a book, you take it out. I've been late too. And you bring it back in a decent amount of time so that other people in your community can do it. It's a contract to share this resource. And the more people we can include, to do this, whether it's people at Rikers, that we do outreach to people at Rikers, because everyone at Rikers is coming back to the community at some point, and we want them to be library users. If it's new asylum seekers that just got off the bus at Port Authority, and they're in our library a day or 2 later, they are not only future library users, but they're future library workers and people in our community that need to use our library. So we don't care. We just see people that need the library. And the more we can get more people to use the library, the more they can buy into this, the more they can trust us, because that's exactly what you were talking about before, about people are losing trust. We're still trusted, not by everybody, but you know what? We're going to keep doing what we can do to try to build more trust in the community.
The libraries are a great institution. And that's why next week, your boss is testifying to City Council.
So, I'll talk, we'll advocate for a second here. So in New York City, where we value libraries, right? And yet every year, we're cut for our funding, and we spend half the year using up precious resources that we could otherwise be serving the community, fighting to get what? The same amount of money as last year. So, the administration, whether it's the current administration or past administrations, fights with the city council, and so there's a cut here, there's a restoration here, they fight it out, and everyone's happy that there's restoration. Meanwhile, we lose 3 to 5% due to the latest inflation, and we are then behind the scenes. We're behind the money, even though we've gotten full restoration and other people are celebrating, and we're realizing you still want us to provide just as much services as we did before with less real dollars. And so we're not only asking for full restoration, we are asking for money to be able to be increased to meet the demand of our community.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask a quick question and a final question. How does the digital online quote revolution affect some of the banning issue? It's still there, right? I mean, it could be the algorithmic AI revolution also will affect some of what we're talking about.
100%. Some students only get access to books at school because they don't have internet at home. So, internet can be expensive depending on where you live, right?
Well, that's a library value too, but
100%. And now with the cuts with libraries being closed during the week and during the weekend, these students are getting even less, resource. They may not even have a tablet, right, to download this book. So there are a lot of issues in terms of equity and access to information that's being overlooked by those that might have these assets and not need it, right? They might have these tools in their hands and take it for granted that everyone, has the same, privilege, and that's not the case in New York City and other places too, where the students that are really being impacted by these bans are being marginalized even further by not having access to books that could be life-saving, and they could be able to have, kind of a community with a character in a book, or find a solution to a problem in a book, or even have a community with others that have read this book.
We're going to be very library. I wanted to ask you, and go around, but you already talked about this, but what can we do? And I don't just mean the people sitting here, but as a community, as the Four Freedoms part, what can we do to ensure that, one, the badding stops in many ways, but that there's an awareness of its dangers and also the power of libraries in the community?
What a beautiful question. So first, I'd say before you leave here today, find Deborah in the blue shirt and grab one of these postcards, because on the back there's a very clear and concrete list of the things that we can all do. One of the things on that list, the first, says speak up at school board meetings and in support of students and educators. And so I am committed to showing up to the next CEC District 2 meeting, and I would love to see some of you all there with me, whether you can be there in person or online. Honestly, even just attending does something and sends a real clear message and helps equip all of us with the skills we need to fight back. And I also think going to our public libraries, posting on social media that we're visiting our public libraries, going and getting a first public library card with a child in your life, using these public institutions and being clear that they're really important to us, and breaking through this narrative. I mean, I think I was on a panel with someone else who works, I'm learning a lot about libraries. Someone who works for both New York Public Library and Brooklyn Public Library, because I guess it's one office that does all the book buying for both of those systems. And when we were on a panel and we were being interviewed by a bunch of teenagers, and the teens asked a question that got her to share that there's only 4 people who staff that entire department. And that, for me, seems like that's already a problem. There was someone who was a librarian at one of the fancy private schools here in New York City, and she was appalled. She was like, oh my gosh, I work in a library system where I have access to all of the possible resources she needs to create access to information for young children. And I believe that every single child in New York City, in our country, in the world, deserves access to that kind of abundance. I was so moved when I went over to the edge of the park and there was the quote, the FDR quote, about what's possible in our time and in our generation. New York City may be the richest in terms of like financial wealth city in this country, in this world, in the history, in human history on the planet. So to have politicians cutting library service on the weekends is ridiculous. They're telling us that there isn't enough money, but there's definitely enough money. And so we need to not buy into these false narratives, and we need to speak up and get loud. Because the people who want to ban books are loud, and we need to be just as loud, if not louder.
Who wants to follow that?
I'll just say really short that libraries have to be prepared, so they have to do their homework and have good collection development policies and be able to feel like when someone's coming up to them and yelling at them, they have the resources again, for that. I would also say too, you need to show up, you need to speak up, whether it's on an individual basis with friends, relatives, non-friends, non-relatives, and speak up and be present at these bigger events. I would also highly recommend the American Library Association is one of many, many organizations that has banded together in United Against Banned Books. That's it, unitedagainstbannedbooks.org. That's, you can go Google it, whatever, later on, but they give you resources as an individual, resources for any organizations that you're part of, so that you can play a part to be on the front lines of this cultural battle right now that we have to win.
I agree with, I'll add a few more resources in the fight. There's also NCAC, we also take citizens cases. So if you know something that's happening in your school district, you need support,
We serve all 50 states, and we work with community members and to help, with this process. And generally, one of the first things we do is we look at the policies of the schools to see that, that a committee is assembled to read the book in entirety before making a decision and making sure that books stay on shelves until the decision is made. So I think those are some of the first places to look at. And also, as Americans, you have the possibilities of submitting a Freedom of Information request. So if you feel like there are books disappearing in your library, you just don't know what happened to these books, you can file a request and find out what happened to these books and go to the board meetings and demand that the books come back. So I think there's ways to be active. In our Kids Right to Read project, which we launched recently, we have basically community groups that are pre-formed come together and learn training on advocacy. Get support through other groups, fighting similar fights with other libraries, school boards, and getting strategies on how to be successful to overturn, these book bans locally. So that's another outlet to get involved. We do have some chapters, I think, in Ulster County, also Manhattan. We have some interest in that as well. So if you're interested in joining that group, we have publishers that are also involved in that fight as well. We also donate books, working with publishers, leading publishers in New York City, to give books to communities that have lost books, although that is not the solution. But in the meantime, to draw community awareness of what's going on, we're able to kind of fill that need while they fight to get the books to return to their libraries, whether school or libraries. So those are some ways of getting involved. But I'd say definitely go to the school board meetings, write op-eds. If you have contacts to media, make stories or appeal to them through social media about the situation that's happening in your communities or even neighboring communities. We find censorship in Connecticut, New Jersey, all the boroughs here. So it is rampant. But what's missing is, like has been mentioned before, is that although all of us oppose it, we're not visible. We're not physically there. And those that are in the minorities to ban the books are more vocal and more present. So I think having more activity and more action and more solidarity is what's needed to kind of demonstrate that there is a bigger force that does oppose these, the censorship that's happening.
Have Amy close it out.
Okay, no pressure. I do want to echo that because there has been polling that's been done by the American Library Association, by every library, that the majority of Americans do not support book bans. They trust one another, their neighbors, members of their community to make decisions for themselves. They're not interested in taking that right away from others. It's really the vocal minority showing up. They're the loudest. In some cases, they're the best funded, the best coordinated. One thing I want to say is that we do need to support school libraries. This is something that you mentioned. Public libraries can do the best we can. In some cases, that kid, if they don't have that book-rich environment in that school, they're not going to make it to the public library, whatever reason they can't. And we need to support teachers, we need to support public librarians. School librarians are having to fight for the right just to exist in some cases, and school libraries are disappearing. Or a school thinks that we have a school library, a bunch of books on a shelf is not a school library. A parent volunteer is not a school librarian. So that is really crucial. Many schools in New York City are out of compliance. They don't have a school librarian, even though they're supposed to, in order to get state funds. So I do want to echo, show up, find ways to support people however you can, even if it's just writing your local library a letter of support. I see you, I appreciate you. Librarians are not okay. There's a lot of fear. There's some bad things happening to our colleagues that is just really hard to stomach right now. I'm trying to turn it around. They need everybody's support, and we cannot afford for our school libraries to kind of fade away at the same time.
Before I thank this extraordinary panel, I just want to put in a point of personal privilege. Please support the nation for 158 years. We've been fighting for selling and for libraries. We've been banned twice. That's another story. But I want to thank you all for this really enlightening conversation. We see the words in the newspapers and in the media, but to hear from you on the front lines is really important. Thank you.
you very much.
Yeah, we start with you, Leslie. Hi, everybody. So I'm Leslie Wright. I work for New York State Parks. I have one of the best jobs in the world. I get to be the regional director for all the 8 state parks in the 5 boroughs of New York City. And being here tonight and hearing this in this most magnificent state park of all, and I will disavow saying that to all the other 8 state parks, the other 7 state parks, but just really thank you all for your commitment. Katrina, thank you for your extraordinary leadership from the beginning with your dad. I have a couple of other comments in addition to these things. One is, Nick, your description of libraries as a place that don't require entry, proof of income, proof of status, any kind of proof of anything, are the natural partners in that category with parks. That's what we do, that's what we are, and we try as much as possible to work with libraries, right? I mean, we have our own brilliantly inspired banned book library here, thanks to the incredible stewardship of Howard Axel, president of the Conservancy, and inspired creative programming that's unparalleled in all of New York City. But we enjoy partnerships with not libraries in all 5 boroughs, but we're working on it. So it's a natural, we can do more. So thank you all, really thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Hi, I have a question, and I know Christine, you touched on this a little bit when you said these books will save lives, and I think I'm sort of your world, but for people that are not in the publishing world, what is the harm that can be done for kids when they don't have access to these books? I'm wondering if you all can elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, I'm glad you asked, because I was looking for a way to share another project that Brooklyn Public Library was just a part of. So I mentioned Books on Demand, and which was a program, we started it 2 years ago. Seattle Public Library started it 1 year ago. And the 2 libraries together, as part of our sign-up process, we asked the young person to tell us why they would like the card, if they're experiencing any censorship, other barriers to access. Collectively, both libraries have collected almost 10,000 stories from young adults across the country. We just published a report summarizing what those young people are telling us. And they say exactly what it's like. What the harm, we talk about the harm when you read this book with the scary thing in it. We should be worrying about the harm when kids don't have access to books at all, or they don't have access to the books that they need to have their identities affirmed, to have their life experiences reflected back at them. The harm is that these young people are telling us they feel alone. They feel like that they're self-censoring themselves, you know, we were talking about soft censorship, this idea of like the intimidation, the fear that's created in this climate, all this conversation that's happening. And they're just not prepared to enter the world as adults, to have the vocabulary they need, to talk about what their life is and who they are and who their friends are. So,
It's a matter of life and death.
literally,
To see themselves in these books.
Yeah.
Teen suicide, and often, you know, a high percentage of teen suicide is related to LGBTQ and not being able to find acceptance. And if you can find acceptance in a book, that helps you get through that next day. And for those books to be some of the most highly censored books in libraries and in schools, that is, now we're really starting to get into a level where it really can affect life and death among, you know, our community.
I agree. We did even an essay contest, how banned books saved my life. We actually had a few of them talk about sexual assaults and how they had no one to talk to, reading a few of the books. help them, you know, overcome the trauma that they experienced in their lives. So, you know, we can't discount the power of books.
Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, everybody. It's freezing
Thank you,
cold.
thank you,
right?
Howard.
In the
I want to thank
program.
Howard for
Right.
programming.
A little bit of water, some other things in the programming tent for anybody that wants to ask any other questions for the next, hopefully, 10 minutes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.